my honor to introduce a very special woman who has been by turns my professor, colleague, and friend, Holli Levitsky. Holli is the founder and director of the Jewish Studies program and professor of English here at LMU. She has published essays, articles, and book chapters on Jewish American and Holocaust literature, literature of the American South, and literature of exile. She is also the co-editor of 2 volumes, The Literature of Exile and Displacement, American Identity in a Time of Crisis, which I had the privilege of co-editing with her, and the book she is here to discuss tonight, Summer Haven, The Catskills, the Holocaust, and the Literary Imagination. Holli has been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Literature in Poland, and a Schusterman Fellow at the Summer Institute for Israel Studies. She is also the Florida International University Exile Studies Scholar in Residence and an affiliated professor at the University of Haifa. Before I give the floor to Holli, I'd like to share with you a little bit about the origins of this project, which you might say began during her Fulbright year in Poland. When she came to LMU in 1990, Holli was an Americanist, focusing on literature of the South and its greatest son, William Faulkner. With the support of her department, she began teaching Holocaust literature courses in 1994. But it was during her time as a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Warsaw from 2001 to 2002 that her scholarly interest in Holocaust studies specifically, and Jewish studies more broadly, became firmly established. There, she taught the university's first ever Holocaust literature course to Polish students, most of whom knew very little about either the Jewish experience from 1939 to 1945, or about the rich legacy of American Holocaust literature. That Fulbright experience not only inspired a biennial study abroad course for LMU students in Poland, but also the development of the LMU Jewish Studies program. Further, it informed Holli's scholarly interest in the post-Holocaust experiences of survivors in the United States. The questions she has investigated in her research since that year in Poland form the basis of Summer Haven. How did Holocaust survivors rebuild their lives and create communities in the United States in the aftermath of the cataclysm, despite the many differences that set them apart? Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Holli Levitsky.
Thank you, Stella. Now we know we educated you well. So smart. Thank you all for coming, really, very much. It's really exciting for me to be here and talk about my research. And really, when you do research, sometimes you just pull together disparate things. And you hope somehow that at the end of it, they make sense. So in this presentation and in this book, I've pulled together 2 topics that may not seem like they relate to one another clearly. That is the Catskills, specifically as a Jewish destination, and the Holocaust. My question that I'm really going to explore tonight is how they connect and what we can learn about both by examining them together. So, a brief history of the Jewish Catskills. Why don't Jewish mothers drink? Alcohol interferes with their suffering. Why do Jewish mothers make great parole officers? They never let anyone finish a sentence. How many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? Sigh. Don't bother, I'll sit in the dark. I don't want to be a nuisance to anybody. So certainly Jewish mothers were not invented in the Catskills, although these Jewish mother jokes were. Also called the Borscht Belt, the Jewish Catskills were a culture unto themselves. The history of the Jewish Catskills begins with the farmlands of Ulster, Sullivan, Southern Green, and a tiny sliver of southeastern Delaware counties. The year-round Jewish population of chicken and dairy farmers had a hard time making a living on the poor soil there and began taking in boarders. Eventually, many made that into their main enterprise. Some boarding houses in the Catskills became what were called kookelins, or kuchelins, the Yiddish pronunciation, which is a cook for yourself. It's a room rented in a boarding house in which kitchen and dining room were shared. These facilities housed 10 to 40 guests, and kukulans frequently developed into bungalow colonies. The facilities, bungalow colonies, they were individual, as you can see, individual small cottages which were rented out, complete with their own kitchen. Often they shared a swimming pool and sometimes a casino, which was really a social hall. Such kukulans, some kukulans later turned into hotels as well, and both kukulans, colonies like this, and hotels provided a real familial milieu. That is, people were together the entire summer and formed very close connections. So you can see how these are laid out like little cities. By the 1950s, though, few kukulans remained, all but replaced by these bungalow colonies and hotels. So the small, let's say 50 to 250 guest hotels, and the medium, say more like 250 to 500 guest hotels, still retained the kukulans' intimacy. The owners were often a pair of in-law couples and were always present. They mingled with guests, many of whom were relatives and friends. So even in large hotels with, say, 500 to 1,000 guests, owners and staff and guests all knew each other. Guests returned often year after year and often from generation to generation. So a child in the day camp one summer might later become a counselor, and later he or she might work as a busboy or waiter in the dining room, and then return once again as a guest with a spouse and children. Guests develop a loyalty to the hotel and its owners based on family, friendship, and on participating in a miniature society where relationships were amplified by the proximity. Many of the workers developed close bonds with each other, with the owners, with the long-standing guests, and many friendships lasted past the summer. Staff-guest romances were also not uncommon. And I'm guessing we might have some anecdotes in here even. Guests made frequent visits to delis and shops in nearby towns, and there's just some pictures in there of the towns. Often these were year-round residents, and they were also, in some of the towns, primarily Jewish. Often guests would stroll past other resorts. They'd visit friends and relatives in other hotels and bungalow colonies. Bungalow dwellers were always sneaking into the hotel casinos because they had the better entertainment. And as I said, the casinos were more like social halls, not really places where gambling happened necessarily. And the guests at the small hotels were doing the same in the big hotels, and staff were perpetually visiting the other hotels for romance. Research has located 863 bungalow colonies and 1,172 hotels that operated in the Catskills. At any given time in the golden era of the 1950s and 1960s, there were about 500 colonies and 550 hotels operating. An estimated 500,000 people vacationed there annually in that period. No matter where you went in the Catskills, you were never far from a hotel or a colony. Catskill hotel keepers pioneered the idea also, and this is rather common now, like Club Med, for instance, other places, where they have an all-inclusive vacation, right? So you've got 3 meals a day, and in the hotels and in the bungalows, also in the casinos there would be perhaps nighttime tea room, nighttime entertainment, sports, activities, day camps for children, as I mentioned. And this was during the decades, of course, when Gentile hotels barred Jews. And during that time, the Catskills offered a vacation with kosher food, with Yiddish conversation, with Jewish comedy, and music as entertainment, so that Jews could go and be with other Jewish families. Even the more expensive resorts would still be, let's say, affordable to the average family for a weekend or a short stay. Much of the artistic material that was produced in these casinos, in the small and larger hotels, was produced in Yiddish, which was a common language among the immigrants who came in the 30s and 40s and populated these places before we start talking about the survivors who came after the war. But the persistence of this Yiddish-speaking, Yiddish-English patois, and of Yiddish jokes in the Catskills after the Holocaust. So when the survivors came and they were also speaking Yiddish, Yiddish began to be seen in the Catskills and, of course, in other places as well as a form of resistance against the Nazi attempt to destroy Jewish life. Most of the murdered Jews of Europe were Yiddish speakers, and the daily use of Yiddish as a language nearly died, except for the Hasidic revival in the later 20th century, and a smaller revival by secular Yiddishists. So jokes like the ones that were up there earlier came out of a Yiddish-speaking world and culture that we refer to as Yiddishkeit. A mini Jerusalem in the mountains. So having a place with land aplenty and the freedom to live on that land was a long-standing Jewish dream. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was in the Jewish heart, in its liturgy, in its literature, and in its folk life for millennia. There are parallels between the return to Israel and the move to the Catskills. Kibbutzniks and others would make the desert bloom and grow the food to support themselves and their whole society in Israel. Jewish farmers moving to the Catskills would try to do something similar, though not as successful beyond milk and eggs. Jewish philanthropist Baron de Hirsch provided funds in the 1930s and 40s to train Jewish farmers to settle all over the world, including the Catskills, but in Argentina, New Jersey, North and South Dakota, in fact, and the Canadian Midwest provinces. And Baron de Hirsch's idea in being a philanthropist for this particular cause was that the land-driven productivity would make Jews acceptable to the larger society. The Jewish farmers, at least in the Catskills, in fact, did something different by building a very strong Jewish-centered culture from the 1890s onward. The extensive Catskills Jewish culture situates a context of hundreds of square miles in the Catskills of almost exclusively Jewish territory. The thousands of resorts were served by synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish tradespeople, and merchants. Jewish cultural institutions, some of you may have heard of, like the Workmen's Circle, the Jewish Agricultural Society, the Farmers Co-op, and the Insurance Co-op. These were all in the Catskills. They created, in a way, really their own sort of promised land. After the masses of immigrants came between the 1890s and the 1920s, and then when the survivors came after, or during the 1940s and after, they built in the United States the largest Jerusalem outside of Israel. And they built their mini Jerusalem in the Catskills. Stemming from strong radical traditions of many Eastern European Jews, the Catskills also became the location for leftists of varying types. Leftists have always been around in Jewish life. And some of those leftists, this was in the 1930s and 1940s, were preparing to return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And others were seeking to build different kinds of utopian societies. For those who wanted to build the promised land, Zionist or Zionist socialist training groups set up camp in the Catskills to recruit and prepare Jews for Aliyah or moving to Israel. And perhaps some of you who have taken a course in Israel here, we offer a couple courses. You may have read about Zev Jabotinsky, who was a Zionist revisionist leader, and he died of a heart attack while visiting one of those camps in the Catskills in Hunter, New York in August 1940. Some hotels were pointedly leftist. At Maud's Summer Ray, most guests were leftists in the pre-World War II era, ecumenically composed of socialists, communists, and Trotskyists. Paul Robeson, if you've heard of him, he was a regular singer and speaker in the Catskills. And at the famous 1949 Paul Robeson concert in Peekskill, the singer and his audience were stoned, not that kind of stoned, but stones were hurled at them while state and local police looked on with encouragement and then arrested the victims, including Paul Robeson. So we can talk about that a little bit afterwards, too. Green Acres Hotel, owned by a socialist New York State assemblyman, sponsored local socialist activities, and hired blacklisted show business figures like Zero Mostel and others. And more recently, another kind of return has occurred in the Catskills, and those are Soviet Jews, whose modern-day large-scale migration to the U.S. began in the 1970s. They made their way to the Catskills even as the area began to fade as a major resort destination. Already in the mid to late 1980s, there are hotels, formerly Jewish resorts in the Catskills, that either cater to or are owned by Soviet Jewish emigres. Among the contributions of this new group is the revival of two old abandoned hotels, which have been tenderly coaxed from near ruin status, but never modernized. So if you go there, and I've done a couple research trips out there, there are several, and the two that I've visited both look like they did in the 1920s and look as if they could really be movie sets for a film about that era. For several years, about the last 10 years or so, younger Russian and other Eastern European immigrants have been retreating in droves to campgrounds in the Catskills for weekend-long music and cultural festivals. Okay, let's look a little bit at anti-Semitism. Sorry about that S, if everyone could just imagine an S there. Anti-Semitism in the United States. So let's look a little bit at anti-Semitism in the United States and how that contributed to the Catskills becoming a Jewish destination. I want to talk a little bit about my family story. My parents took their honeymoon in 1946. There's my mom and dad and their honeymoon on the right. And my mom, I think, just before, maybe earlier that day on the left there. And they took their honeymoon at a place called the Nevele Hotel and Country Club in Sullivan County, New York. Ulster? Oh, okay. All right. Have to correct that research. The Catskills beckoned the young couple as they had welcomed tens of thousands of Jews, young and old, American and immigrant, families and singles for decades. Like my mother and her family, the Jews vacationing in the Catskill Mountains came primarily from New York City. In New York City and in this United States, it was expected that my mother's friends, parents like her own, had thick foreign accents. They were from the old country. They spoke Yiddish at home, and they worked hard to try to achieve the American dream. One sign of success amongst this group was the ability to take a summer holiday in the Catskill Mountains. Families and close friends or neighbors might share the cost of a rented van for the 2-hour ride from Brooklyn to Sullivan County. I have to do that, check that on that one. But I was pretty sure it's in Sullivan County, but maybe Ulster. And then they would rent rooms or cabins at the same bungalow colony or kuchelen. My mother's first kuchelen in Ellenville was a large farm with chickens, and they had hay rides and cows. Her father, like the other fathers, came up only on weekends. The American and immigrant Jews who made the many hotels and bungalow colonies and farms of Ulster and Sullivan counties their summer retreats year after year were always looking for family here, for what's called Landsmannschaften, which is a society of immigrants from the same town or region. They were looking for a home away from home. As a second home to generations of Jews, the Catskill Mountains became a place where a Jewish family could bond as a Jewish family. That is, they could practice the culture of Judaism without the pressure to assimilate. Families spending summers together with other Jews could anticipate recreating and recreating with these Jewish friends year after year. The Jewish threads of their winter lives might seem to be slowly unraveling through their increasingly secular lives. But the Catskills remained essentially a subculture that was renewed year after year. And because the Catskill Mountains summoned one with the promise of a prolonged engagement, that is, that it would go on year after year, and deeply felt connections, that is, replacing the congestion of the city for the wide open spaces, children and adults mingled together. So it was a multi-generational community. The parents might feel naches as their children paraded their gifts through the weekend talent shows. They might cook meals together in the common kitchen of the Kuchelen. They might meet for card games every evening. For the parents, each day must have been another rare and wonderful moment when time stands still amid the deep well of family love, safely netted by a sense of community so complete, indeed, it seemed impossible to find elsewhere. So by the time my mother's modern Orthodox family took their summer holidays in Ellenville or Monticello or Woodridge, Sullivan or Ulster counties, staying at chicken farms or rooming houses, it was already a segregated world. Lost was the innocence of the Founding Fathers' declaration that all men are created equal, part of our world, right? Jews were restricted from participating fully in American society in a number of ways. They experienced professional bias and discrimination by hotels, country clubs, and resorts. Neighborhoods and cities limited or denied access to Jews hoping to purchase houses or land, including right here in Los Angeles. Jews could not buy land here. Influential Americans, such as Henry Ford, there he is, were publicly denouncing Jews as either international financiers intent on world domination, or, if you prefer, godless Bolsheviks who undermined American policy and morality. Take your pick. Americans turning into their radios during the 1930s might hear from my hometown of Detroit Father Coughlin's weekly anti-Semitic broadcasts from his pulpit. They might open their Dearborn Independent newspaper and read Mr. Ford's page with its anti-Semitic commentary. Those Jews who returned each year to the Catskill Mountains, again, primarily from New York, but also, in my case, from Detroit or Philadelphia or Baltimore, were seeking escape not just from the thick heat of another urban summer. They were hoping to escape from the darkening forces of the era's anti-Semitic proscription. So let's turn now to the survivors and see how the Holocaust fits into this story. A new kind of Jewish immigrant community was born from and after World War II, and they too purchased or leased colonies in the Catskills together. They too were looking for family and a home away from home. They too shared a past, but their past was in a lost and now vanished world. They were stressed not only from the terrifying and exhausting act of losing their homes and families, they were traumatized from experiences that defied comprehension. Most survivors, or each survivor certainly, had undergone uniquely horrifying traumatic experiences during the war years. They may have survived in a concentration camp or a work camp or in hiding, either literally or with an Aryan identity. They may have been in the ghettos. They may have escaped to a safer city or country. But wherever they were hunted by Nazis or their collaborators, marked for death because they were Jews. That community lost everything, yet citizens of that community survived. So survivors asked themselves very existential questions. Not just, who am I, after losing so many of their loved ones. They asked themselves, where can I live as a Jew? Where will the world have me? Because when the war ended, most survivors were young, and as you can imagine, and it was very early in life to be thinking about such issues as finding a spot on the earth where people do not want to kill you. but they were also alone. So where were they to go? Germany and Poland offered little more than bad memories and remnants of anti-Semitism. Few options were available to the survivors as they arrived in the United States. When the contingent of displaced persons and survivors from Hitler's mass murder of European Jews began to come to America, they were entering a new world and a new world order. They did not know what to expect. Confronted with a number of challenges, there was absolutely no precedent to the predicament they were in. So in my research, I was looking for answers to several questions. Was assimilation into American life, in particular American Jewish life, different for these Holocaust survivors than for those earlier Jewish immigrants coming from Europe? And if so, why was it so difficult for this particular wave of refugees to settle into their new lives in the United States? In other words, how did the trauma affect really their ability to assimilate or their inability to assimilate as other earlier refugees had done? One answer to these questions addresses the breadth of Jewish belief and practice. So just as earlier Jewish immigrants, and indeed in any Jewish society you can find around the world, for the most part, even Israel, Jews hold widely divergent views about Jewish practice, about ritual, faith, and culture, and certainly about the idea of Jews assimilating into their host culture versus separatism or remaining separate from the larger culture. These views, too, or this range of views, was held as well by these refugees. So we can't lump all of the Holocaust survivors into one category and say they were all religious Jews or they were all secular Jews. Like any Jewish community, they found themselves holding a span of views. And of course, the US was never free of our own nativist attitudes. And indeed, on the crest of any wave of immigration, there was often an uptick in anti-Semitism. And so this post-World War II surge of Jewish displaced persons, which is what they were called in the beginning before we began to call them survivors, their immigration posed special problems. So another possible answer has to do with numbers, how many came in, and how this large group was resettled in the United States, those that came to the United States. Because, of course, they went elsewhere. They went to Palestine, which became Israel. They went to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, South America, etc. So in the first years after the war, 140,000 European Jews, displaced persons, came to the United States, 140,000, within just about 3 years. Where they settled was usually not their choice, as special agencies had been created to deal with the onslaught of new refugees, and of course, their huge housing and employment needs. Perhaps you've heard of the Truman Directive, so that facilitated certain shifts in procedures for dealing with this enormous surge in immigration, such as allowing organizations, in addition to individuals, the right to provide affidavits for DPs. And given our conversations now about immigration, this should, really sort of raise some questions. New agencies were created to direct the resettlement process. So in addition to quotas and other restrictions imposed on these new immigrants, they had to deal with newly developed agencies whose workers, although well-intentioned, had no experience treating such monumental financial, legal, emotional, and physical needs. My research shows that these 140,000 new immigrants settled all over the United States. Public perception was that the new refugees were happy to be given a second chance and adjusted relatively easily to American life. But in my interviews and my research, I've found that accounts by survivors themselves and case studies from the early years of their new lives by social workers and others really suggests otherwise. So a third reason why settlement was difficult really has to do with the trauma itself. Holocaust survivors tried to adjust to what we might consider normal family life, but those attempts were colored by the intensity of the trauma which of course did not disappear with the end of the war and the liberation of the camps. For many survivors, liberation functioned only on the physical level. That is, even after safely arriving in the United States, they continued to feel the terror they experienced during the Holocaust, as if it were a second skin. Liberation did not save them from the imprint of trauma on their minds. Another reason why assimilation was difficult has to do with the established Jewish community at the time. Years earlier, American Jews worried about the large influx of Eastern European Jews and their greenhorn ways. These new immigrants posed similar problems with language, clothing, food, and other old country habits. American Jews, you have to remember, in the 40s and 50s were very modern, assimilated American Jews. They were very modern, right? And they felt sympathy and compassion for their brethren, but many also feared that too many Jews who stood out as Jews would provoke or might provoke more anti-Semitism. So it was with some ambivalence that American Jews, even some American Jewish leaders, hoped the displaced persons might settle elsewhere, not in the United States, perhaps in Palestine. There we go. That's a group of survivors. The tension between newly arriving survivors and American Jews can perhaps best be characterized by what survivor and author Charlotte Delbo wrote about her experience. She says, "Auschwitz is so deeply etched in my memory that I cannot forget one moment of it." In their minds, they return to the war years. Their conversations meander to that place time and again, feeling the loss each and every time. Survivors could tell horrific stories of those years as if they were commonplace, as if escaping death was a trip to the corner store for milk. But those who had not also lived through these terrors could not understand the need to talk about these terrors. By their very act of living, survivors tell us they survived. All of us are born, they say, but we survived. When you lose your family, they say, you make friends with those who are like family, who have experienced the same loss and seek the same kind of comfort. Survivors are a culture, a people who share a deep sense of gratefulness without forgetting for 1 second all they have lost. So the pleasure in being with other survivors was to be able to feel the loss, to speak the loss, to share the loss, and in some ways, to revel in their difference from the others. Still, the public face of the post-war immigration surge has long shown that happy state of refugees settling in the U.S. after their terrifying experiences. Americans in general were under the impression that bringing these displaced European refugees to our democratic republic was enough, and that once settled here, they could quickly return to being father, mother, wife, husband, son, daughter. But this attitude sadly contradicts the reality of life for most, if not all, of survivors. For they were survivors, and that meant they had to leave their many dead, mostly murdered relatives, friends, neighbors behind, graveless and without mourners. They had witnessed the worst atrocities humans were capable of committing and then had to go on living. Former professor of mine at UC Irvine, Ruth Kluger, wrote this wonderful book in her 70s about being a survivor, being a child survivor. She wrote this one in 2001. She translated it from the German, the original German. And she writes in there that when she first came to the US as a displaced person, her American aunt told her, "You have to erase from your memory everything that happened in Europe. You have to make a new beginning. You have to forget what they did to you. Wipe it off like chalk from a blackboard." We can see, though, this book was widely popular. Her German memoir, similar book, slightly different in German, that she wrote first, sold over 250,000 copies in Germany. It was one of the very first Holocaust memoirs to become a bestseller in Europe. So she obviously rejected that invitation to forget, and didn't believe, in fact, that survivors were better off leaving their past behind, neither to think nor talk about what happened in Europe. It would also be better, she thought, for Americans, Jews in particular, they also thought that it would be better for Jews in particular to have the Jewish refugees start over as Americans, and she rejected that as well, instead of leaving her story at the door of importation, taking it with her and telling her story in both German and English. But even as family and friends, caseworkers, and others urged the survivors to forget the past and what was lost, we know, of course, it's not possible for victims of such trauma to simply leave everything behind and start over. As I mentioned, survivors that I've interviewed and case studies I've read talk about how they wanted to tell their story to fellow Jews. It was not a culture of silence, as many have written, but rather that they found little sympathy and little interest among other Jews and Americans in general in hearing about the atrocities, which some found too gruesome and others simply couldn't believe. Perhaps even more startling in my research, I discovered were the social workers, the psychiatrists and psychologists who treated the survivors' traumatic experiences and symptoms as if they were in the normal range of human experience. Again, this was the 1950s when they were coming here. And there were a number of reasons, as I've mentioned, why people in the helping professions didn't or couldn't address the particular mental and physical health issues of survivors, and why the American public was equally resistant to offer the kind of help they needed. Among those reasons were, let's say, the guilt over being safe in America while the Jews were being murdered in Europe. The first workers' responses in the displaced persons camps indicated this physical survival, as I've talked about, right? So you'd see the survivors, if you were, among the liberators, you'd see the survivors, and sure, their bodies were emaciated. We've seen those photos, but they survived, right, physically. But the first workers, the people who came, didn't think that their emotional needs also needed to be taken care of in that time. And part of that reason is, again, it was the 1950s, and this is Freudian time. This is when, the psychology of the time was Freudian psychoanalysis, which really, and all the healing professions really bought into the Freudian map, right, of human behavior, which meant that any mental health diagnosis was filtered through the patient's childhood development. And of course, whether or not you had difficulties in potty training didn't affect the trauma necessarily, affect the trauma that you experienced as a survivor. And of course, it would be ludicrous to apply those same kinds of healthcare responses to the Holocaust survivors. But that's what they tried to do in the 1950s because it was really all about Freud. And finally, not finally in terms of reasons, but in terms of the reasons that I'm offering, was really an inability to confront the depth of the Holocaust destruction. And this is still, I have students from my Holocaust Lit class, some of them here. It's still something that when I teach the Holocaust every year, it's just a very, very difficult concept to wrap your mind around. How do you teach anyone, students of any generation, that 6.5 million Jews were murdered simply because they were Jews? All of these reasons facilitated a gulf between the American Jewish community and its professionals and the survivors themselves. Moreover, countless studies have shown that the massive physical and emotional disruption in the lives of Holocaust survivors have continued to affect them to the end of their lives. Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer refers to the present lives of survivors as a life after death called survival, and a life within death for which we have no name, only the assurances of witnesses. Clearly, the trauma of the Holocaust caused an irreparable rupture in the memories of survivors and became the focal point for their identities. Okay, so how do we bring this together now, right? We've got the Catskills, the Jewish Catskills, and we've got the survivors who have come to this country, have sought a haven somehow, and perhaps have not felt as welcomed as they imagined by the American Jewish community. So maybe some of you have read Art Spiegelman's graphic novels, Mouse 1 and Mouse 2. And what I've got here is just a few frames from Mouse 2 where they're in the Catskills, where Vladek has a bungalow colony, and where he finds solace. He's a difficult man. He's had many very difficult experiences also, and being in the Catskills is his happy place, right, where he finds some joy and some solace. The book also conveys an inability for Vladek Spiegelman, the survivor whose story his son tells in these two graphic novels, an inability for him to communicate successfully with people. So that ability to really tell his story, tell why he is feeling the way he does, why he has the anxieties he does, is really shown against the background of this beautiful place, right? The Catskills, not just a beautiful mountain retreat, but also full of Jewish people, like Vladek, right? So the gulf continued to widen over time as survivors tried to tell their stories, but found little sympathy and little interest in hearing about the Holocaust. And so for several decades after the war ended and refugees settled into their new homes here, they looked for ways to replace what was lost. They turned to American culture, which seemed so successfully to shape identity. American culture in the 1950s and 60s, right? John Wayne, the heroic story of, American victory in the war. It seemed to tell them how to become more a part of the American victory and less part of Jewish victimhood. So if they turn to their televisions, for example, on May 27th, 1953, they might have seen survivor Hannah Block-Kohner unveiled as the honoree on one of the most popular entertainment programs of the 1950s, This Is Your Life. It's a great clip. If you get it on YouTube, you can see the whole thing. These are just some stills, but it's really great. They would have heard the host, the legendary Ralph Edwards, muse that Hannah seemed more like a young American girl just out of college, not at all like a survivor of Hitler's cruel purge of German Jews. He washed her clean of that Jewish victimhood and made her an American hero. So no Jewish particularism. Rather, Hannah was just another American Jewish girl, perhaps just an American girl, perhaps a college girl. They might also have watched their television with great interest in 1961 as the Eichmann trial unfolded in Israel, preparing to hear the totality of the final solution against the Jews emerge story by story, right? Finally, the trial is there. It's being shown on the news every night. It's going on in Israel. People are ready to finally hear what happened to the Jews in Europe. What was this catastrophe? But instead, when they opened their New York Times the next day for the analysis or watched the CBS Evening News, the American press coverage again presented the Holocaust as a universal tragedy, using the trial to raise, in a general way, moral questions about responsibility and the nature of evil than about the particularity of the Jewish Holocaust. So how did they replace what was lost and essentially irreplaceable? How did they go on with their lives in the face of this vacuum? For the survivors of Hitler's Europe, there was no way to replace what had been taken from them. Instead, in trying to recover their lives in this new land, they faced misunderstanding and frustration. The American and early immigrant Jews had a difficult time understanding the extent of the survivors' loss since they either didn't know the world of Jewish Eastern Europe before the war or left before it became a graveyard. So how could the survivors understand, how could the survivors' friends and neighbors understand what had happened under those circumstances? In the lives of post-war American Jews who were fearful of that anti-Semitism, they didn't want to bring attention to themselves as Jews. And so what became the new religion? A kind of conformity. If assimilation cost them their identities, it was worth it not to stand out and face tacit, overt, and even deadly forms of anti-Semitism that the Jews had faced in Europe. So the Catskills became a place where they could go find other Jews and other Jewish communities. Even if they were not religious, conformity to American national identity, whatever it looked like it at any given time, didn't comfort the survivors. But where other Jews were, right, where other Jews found solace, might. Although what was lost differed from person to person, the imperative to tell the tale of that loss was common to most survivors. So they needed to find communities where they would find affirmation and comfort. And some found those communities in the Catskill Mountains, where together with other survivors, they could retreat from the sometimes creepy post-war cultural patriotism of their American brethren. They could be with those who were like family, friends who shared some of the same places before the war, concentration camps, hiding, etc. And when they were in the Catskills, they didn't have to worry about unfolding their clothes. And if they were in Auschwitz, showing the tattoo that they got there, that one didn't really know whether to keep, to hide. In the Catskills, with other survivors, they didn't have to think about that. So on the East Coast, the Catskills resorts that catered to survivors were destinations that might have mirrored some of their earlier retreats back in Europe. So these are just some mountain retreats that are very popular with Poles, were very popular with Jewish Poles also. They still exist at Zakopane in the mountains in southern Poland. And these places that they found in the Catskills, these mountain resorts, might have mirrored some of those holidays of their former lives. They might have escaped the Nazis with nothing or almost nothing of their former lives intact, but their pre-war lives had been rich with family, friendships, religion, culture, school, work, holidays. If they had lived in Poland, which was not unlikely since Poland's pre-war Jewish population of 3.3 million was the second highest in the world, they might have taken summer holidays or winter holidays together in any of these quaint villages in the mountains, skiing, etc. Together in the ghettos, camps, and in hiding, survivors shared innumerable experiences that made them, these are just some photos I was taking of, this is what they would have looked like, of course, and in this picture from one of the camps, they were together in what one might call intimate strangers, and sharing these hardships, witnessing what happened together, really made them very tightly bonded. So it's not surprising, it wasn't surprising to me to discover these colonies, discover survivors living together, summering together, who were from similar camps or in hiding together, pursuing life together afterwards as well. Because how can we who were not there really understand how complicated and ongoing the effects of the trauma were on their post-war lives? So together they could talk about their past, they could share their dark moments, but they could also share the pre-war lives, right? Who they were before Hitler, their families, their professions, their homes. They would know what it meant to be from a certain city or a certain village or a certain place, and also know that their lives did not begin with Hitler, but as human beings who were loved and wanted. So again, I've interviewed many survivors, and really it comes out to the same thing over and over again, that these places were surprising in how much comfort they offered when the survivors could be together with other survivors. So the book that I wrote really looks at a number of different novels, short stories, plays, graphic novel, a couple very literary memoirs, all of which are about the Holocaust in the Catskills in some way or another. And in all of these, one of the common threads is that the natural vitality of the Catskills has always been presented as so forceful and life-affirming that it has the power to calm even a fevered soul. One of these, the Four Seasons Lodge up there, that's just the DVD cover. It's a wonderful film by Andrew Jacobs, and in it a group of survivors, it's a documentary about a group of survivors who purchase a bungalow colony together, and they return to it each summer. Cradled by the setting in the Catskills, their dramas and resolutions, their war and pre-war lives are played out on its landscape. Its boundaries, geographically but also emotionally, safely cushion the ride. They know they are safe because of those boundaries. In this bungalow colony, with these friends beside them, they can stretch themselves a little further, dance a little harder than usual. And they return to their full-time houses and neighborhoods the same person, but as they put it, they carry those special friends, the other survivors, in their heart. They have become their lost father's wide arms, their murdered husband's loving embrace, and in time, family becomes a place in your heart that you carry with you always, even when the end comes, really revealing a place no longer there. So when I began research for this book, I quickly realized that the quantity and the quality of literary, filmic, and testimonial narratives about Jewish life and culture in the Catskills stands as a testament to the power of nurturing such worlds in memories. And I just put up there two books that were really influential in this project. Hasia Diner, she's an American Jewish historian, and Beth Cohen, another American Jewish historian, and both of them have really been influential in switching the paradigm from thinking about American life and the reception of the survivors as facing kind of a silent wall. They didn't want to talk. Nobody wanted to hear them. To they wanted to talk. They wanted to share these experiences, but it was very difficult for people to listen to them. The Catskills nurtured generations of Jewish Americans who could not travel elsewhere, and it nurtured many of the displaced persons who came to the U.S. after the war. These shared memories offer lessons about the challenges of aging, the comfort of old friends, the power of memory, and the importance of embracing joy even in the face of mortality. This legacy is also the broader Catskills legacy and gives us an opportunity to dwell in that world again. In All's Well That Ends Well, Shakespeare identified the need we all have to hold in memory that which was loved and lost. He writes, "Praising what is lost makes the remembrance dear, even as that loss is absolute and all-consuming." And finally, I just wanted a quiz. Does anybody know where this movie, Dirty Dancing, took place? The Catskills. Thank you very much. Can we see it? Or?
Q&A.
Okay.
Okay, so we have reserved approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers. Does anybody want to begin?
Did you find many families with a survivor in their midst who did not want to talk about the experiences, even families who didn't know that their survivor was a survivor?
Yes.
Were you able to talk to the families or get some information?
Everyone I talked to, and in the case studies I read, particularly in Beth Cohen's book, they had already talked. So no one spoke to me as the first time they were telling their story. It seems to me that people who have never told their story, survivors who have never told their story, form kind of a special group. And it wouldn't be to just me. I think they would speak. Maybe they would go into, the USC archives or some of the other archives where they take testimony that way. But I have run across a couple. Actually, my husband, one of his clients was a survivor, and I tried to talk to him. He'd never talked. He just called himself a survivor, but he had never, even to his own children, told his stories, and he didn't want to tell me either. So I've certainly run across that. The ones who were interested in talking, I feel like really had the opportunity already to talk enough so that they had shaped a narrative. So it wasn't as if they went back each time and thought through that experience again, feeling the same kind of feelings that trauma would necessarily bring up, I think. Rather, they had shaped their narrative, their story in a certain way that, I don't want to say it was safe, but it was a way that they were used to. It was a story they had told already. So those are the kinds of stories. And since I'm not an historian at all in any way, I use history when I teach the Holocaust because you have to. And also I, as an interviewer, I come at it very differently than an historian would or someone who's an expert. So I never tried to penetrate into that.
So, for the survivors, when they came back to the Catskills, did they form was there like a Polish community and a Russian community? Did they, like they did in New York, there were different neighborhoods? Do you know?
Yes. Again, short answer, but I'm happy to elaborate. Yes. Jews tend, maybe this is all tribes. We find people who are like us. So yeah, in fact, the 1939 Club, now called the 1939 Society, was founded by Polish survivors in 1954. And some of them knew each other and some of them didn't, but the idea was they were all Polish survivors. And I think the German survivors have also formed some of their own groups. Catskills was exactly the same. So it would be people probably of the same background. Certainly Polish, German, maybe even Hungarian.
So I'm trying to get a timeline organized in my mind. So pre-World War II, there was a thriving Catskills Jewish community, and I guess I'm trying to think. So let's just talk about pre-1940. Were those more wealthy individuals who were able to have the means to spend the entire summer in the Catskills, and then post 1945, the survivors, I assume, didn't have the means to spend the entire summer there? I just can't quite.
Sure, yeah. So one of the things, like my mother, who came from a very poor family, an immigrant family, they would get together when this was the 1930s and 1940s, before she got married. But even going to the Nebly Hotel, you saw that was kind of a nicer hotel. They could only afford the night, so it was the wedding night was there, not the honeymoon was the wedding night. Not going to go into that detail. But in the case of when she was younger and went up there, they were very poor. And so what they did was they joined with other families. They rented a van together. That's how most people got up there at the time. And they would rent a room in a kuchelen. So basically you were renting for a couple dollars, maybe for the week. You were renting a room, the whole family lived in the room, you'd use the kitchen together with the other families who were renting other rooms in this, usually a farmhouse. And then it was very cheap, it was very affordable, and the fathers, husbands, almost always just came up on the weekend. Now, if you had a lot of money, that's a whole different story. So I'm talking mostly about the immigrant families, the poorer families, not my family. But I know stories from friends and colleagues whose families went to Grossinger's, which would have been the very big, Ritz, I guess the Ritz of the place. And there are a couple other, I'd say maybe a half a dozen to a dozen at any one time, really nice luxury hotels. Almost all of the hotels included this one price method. So, so you paid one price wherever it was. Maybe it was a lower price at the lesser hotels and a higher price at the better hotels, but you still got everything. So it was a one price kind of thing. And I think some of it was family too. So if your family always went to one particular hotel, the Liberty or the Nevele, you might, the richer relatives might take care of you, things like that.
Thank you.
I guess, can you hand it to me?
In the back?
Yeah, I have a question. I always heard that the Catskill was a breeding ground for a lot of Jewish comedians. That's where they got their starts. And so, from what I remember from seeing Dirty Dancing and other movies, it seemed that these places were happy places. Did ever people really think about some of the Holocaust survivors who came there? Did they were ever approached? Was anyone talked about it? Or it was just glossed over and it was just all fun and comedies and good times?
One of the stories, thank you for the question, it's a good question, because of course it's a place that not only offers solace, but it was really what they call the nursery for Jewish comedy. And many, many comedians, including Jerry Seinfeld, got their start up there. It was considered unseemly, let's just say that, to talk about the Holocaust and to talk about the suffering in that kind of a situation, on that kind of landscape where people were coming in order to enjoy themselves, have a good time. It would have been unseemly to talk about it in public. But that said, there were jokes. I mean, Jews have always made jokes about whatever situation we're in. And so a lot of times the jokes, someone returns their food and the waiter says, "What, by Hitler you ate better?" So there'd be just integrated into their life these kinds of references, whether we call them jokes or not. But it would have been unseemly to say, sit at a dinner and say, start talking about their experiences during the Holocaust. So Jake Ehrenreich, one of the stories in the book, he wrote A Jew Grows in Brooklyn. He has an off-Broadway show that he does, and the book is based on his show. And what he said was, the survivors laughed in the Catskills and cried at home. So, yeah.
If you don't mind my adding to it a couple of things. Number one, my sister's mother-in-law owned a kochelein when my sister was an upper teenager, and you're making me remember she finally married the guy, but the mother-in-law, the future mother-in-law invited my sister up. She was probably 16, 17, and my mother wouldn't let her go because it would be horrible to go to a single girl going up. And I remember that Norman's mother called my mother to introduce herself and say, "Don't worry, and I'll watch her and I'll make sure everything is fine and nothing will happen, blah, blah," so she got permission to go. Also in 1961, I went to the Concord Hotel, which was a very, very ritzy kind of, but I think about it, it must have been like a pre-run into Las Vegas because it was like a city within itself. When you went downstairs, there was everything and anything you wanted there, and I met my husband there. My sister sent me on a mission, and my sister is very forceful. You're going to go there and meet a nice Jewish guy. So I wouldn't dare come back without meeting a nice Jewish guy. So I did, and we did get married. But I wasn't aware of the Holocaust survivors being there even in 1961. And the thing I must add, I don't know what year it started, but when you went to Grossinger's, the Concord, the Nevele, all the other hotels, you were fed from morning to night. You ate like you can't begin to imagine. And the waiters brought everything that was on the menu. They brought one of everything to the table besides what you ordered. So you went from a meal to a meal to a meal, and then at night there was the what do you call it? Not the lounge.
The casino.
The casino, and there was food again to be bought, and people just really, really had a good time. They danced, they laughed. It was really a fun, fun place. I do love New York.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I just have like a few random comments. First of all, a lot of the reason that people left for the summer was because the mother and the kids, it was so hot in the city that, that they just, they would just want to get out of the city. The other thing was my dad always told me we were related to the Grossingers. But by the time that I was old enough to appreciate that, that was closed. But he did take me to the Concord in the 80s. So it was, I don't know if it's still open, it was a huge place. I mean, to me it was very institutional. I was really looking for something more charming. And yes, there was a lot of food. And one of my memories, Julio Iglesias was performing there. So there were not just Jews there. There were some Italian women from New York, I remember. And the other thing was they had a big swimming pool, but like I was the only person swimming. Everybody else was sitting around the side, like wearing a lot of gold jewelry. If they would have gone in the pool, they probably would have sank. Those are my impressions. Oh, and we went horseback riding near there. That was like amazing. That was really, it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous area.
Thank you. Yeah, I put a couple different swimming pools up there. Those were all little.
They had like a lake too.
Yeah, there are many, many lakes up there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm a shill. I grew up in Ellenville, New York, and that's why I knew that Ellenville was in Ulster County. I didn't intend to embarrass you.
No. I mean, I want my research to be right.
And so I represent a little different aspect of the Catskills because my grandfather was the immigrant, and he started a lumber company in that area, which my father then ran, and then my brother ran. It was 3 generations that dealt with this, and they sold building materials to the owners of these hotels and bungalow colonies that you described. And so I have a kind of a little different take on all of this, which is so, but I know all about the area in terms of what you told us today. But there were those of us who were not guests in the hotels and bungalow colonies and Coca Lanes, but who actually lived in the communities like Ellenville and Fallsburg and Spring Glen and so forth, and made our livings there and grew up in that area. So anyway, this was fun for me today.
So
Thank you. Yeah.
So what was it like in the summer when people came up? How did?
Well, in the summer, these people were, we felt conflicted, of course, because we were the natives, right? But it was very important for our livelihoods to have these people come in the summertime. And I must tell you that I remember this so vividly. My father used to sell building materials. He used to sell building materials to the owners of the bungalows and the hotels. And in order for him to do this, he had to borrow money in the early spring, borrow from the banks so that he could obtain lumber and nails and paint and so forth. And then he sold all of these products to the owners of the hotels and bungalow colonies who also bought on credit. And then you prayed that it didn't rain that summer because everybody depended on everybody else. And around about August, I was one of 3 children, and my father would, on Sundays, because we were Shabbat observers, he would pile the kids in the car and we would go collecting. We would go from hotel to bungalow colony and visit and ask if they would begin to pay on their bills.
Did the children help?
Well, they would give us milk and cookies, and we used to sing. If the collections will be all right, we will have some beer tonight. We had a good time. So that's a little extra tidbit.
Well, I have this, I just want to add a couple of words to the gentleman behind me who asked about staying up there all summer. A lot of families who didn't have the money to stay for the whole summer would save during the year their pennies so that they could take the father's vacation week or maybe 2 if they were able to, just to go up there for that time. And that was their way of getting away from work and the city and the heat and everything. It was like a different world from the city.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, one of the novels that's excerpted in the book called Dusk in the Catskills, beautiful novel written in 1946. And in it, it's about a hotel keeper, and this hotel keeper has several mortgages on his hotel. And they're Gentile. The farmers who own the mortgage, own the properties, are Gentiles in the area. And the hotel keeper, sort of the whole theme of the book of his concern about what's going on in Europe to the Jews. He's a European immigrant, so he's hearing about and worried about what's going on in Europe during the war. There's also this parallel theme of his own little hotel and how he's going to pay. He's worried that people less and less are coming to the Catskills, that his hotel is very small, maybe people aren't going to want to come to his hotel, and then also that he has perhaps these unsympathetic, the people who he has the mortgage with are perhaps unsympathetic to his plight, both as a small hotel owner, but also as a Jew. So the sort of anti-Semitism that he felt, or the difference he felt between his life and the Gentiles who lived in the area too. He lived there full time also in the novel. Thank you for that.
Was there any Jewish mafia presence up there?
Absolutely. So, and again, one of the pieces in the anthology, which is a comedy about the Catskills and the Holocaust, strange as that might seem, it's called Summer on a Mountain of Spices. And it's narrated by a young man. He's about 13 or 14 years old, and he's obsessed with the mall that one of the Jewish mobsters has left at the hotel for the summer, while the mobster's back in the city taking care of business. So he's obsessed with her. She's voluptuous, girlfriend of a mobster kind of guy. So.
I apologize, folks. In the interest of time, we have time for one more question. It's going to come to, was there a hand?
That's fine.
Okay, let's go this way.
I loved hearing all about the Catskills and
Can't hear
Hold
you.
it closer.
the Jewish version of what was going on there. As a child, we went to the Catskills every summer. We were Irish, my parents had been born in Ireland. We went for 1 week, kind of same situation. My dad saved, put aside just a little bit every paycheck. He was a Teamster. And then we would go there. And my memory is sort of a microcosm of what it was like for the Jewish community. It was all Irish. The men typically played an instrument, and we had get-togethers in the evening, and the dancing, and the whole thing, and eating homemade food that cooked in a community kitchen. And so it brought back a lot of wonderful memories. So thank you.
Thank you. There's a book that's out, I think. It was like years ago about the Irish and the Catskills. I can't remember the author, but look it up. Or, yeah. I was very interested to hear that. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay, once again, can you please help me extend my appreciation?